Hello there. So this video is bound to be controversial, which is not why I'm doing the video, but rather why it's taken me so long to jump into this particular topic. You see, I needed to have the backing of my other videos to tackle something like this, to have all the references and backup concepts available. Intellectually honest actors in good faith will engage with my references and take my observations seriously. But most will just click off angrily when they hear something they don't like. I have no control over this, nor do I want any. You're free to do what you will, and that is the point, unironically. Ultimately, this position of libertarianism is untenable. It will not hold because it, by its own admission or definition or whatever, has no telos, no purpose, no common aim, no goal. At least not one by which it could be defined. So I'm not saying it can't be defined right now or it hasn't been defined, or it could be defined later. I'm saying that you can never define this term in a way that it will have independent but coherent, consistent, and reliable meaning. In other words, you could have a personal definition and somebody else could have a personal definition. And maybe three people could have a similar enough personal definition. But it really doesn't scale past that. That's usually what the problem is. And what they're defining is not libertarianism. So that makes libertarianism a chameleon, a shapeshifter, a ghost. It's an evasion of responsibility for what is, while avoiding responsibility for making anything equal to or better than what is. Now, how can I say this? How do I make such a claim? Let's review, shall we? And yeah, you have to kind of crib this stuff from the internet because the internet's the zeitgeist. For worse or for worser. Libertarian philosopher Roderick T. Long, and I quote, "Any political position that advocates radical redistribution of power from the coercive state to voluntary association of free individuals." End quote. Any political position? So libertarianism seems to apply to more than a single political position. That is true. That is part of my thesis. I agree with him on that. Advocates a radical redistribution of power? What is your definition of power, sir? I have one. Check it out. I bet he doesn't. From the coercive state? What if the state isn't coercive? What does coercive mean? Aren't states always coercive? Isn't the idea of a state coercive? Voluntary association? What is voluntary? Ooh, that's actually trickier than you think. Free individuals? Well, if they're in a coercive state, it seems to imply, this quote, that they're already not free individuals. So that can't happen. This is always my argument too. Like these people have to say, I'm like, well, if what you say is true, then what you want can't happen. It's not an option, right? Like, suppose you want to say that, men had all the power and that's why they won't give any power to women. And then somebody says, well, actually, they gave the power to vote to women. So obviously, the first statement can't be true if the second statement is also true. Oops, this is a similar concoction. And look, I've lost a bunch of audience already. I'm sure of it. That's fine. But check out the Wikipedia page. It's a mess, but it's not wrong. This whole idea is a mess. It's a mess. It doesn't make any sense. And look, I get it. You feel alienated, alone, hurt, disenfranchised. Feel like you haven't been listened to. And it is at this point that I'll note that libertarianism originates from left-leaning politics. Interesting. More splitting. More protest. So what do you think happened to get you into this state? Well, obviously you can't be on the right. You can't be a conservative or a Republican because, man, those guys, they're just all tyranny, coercive state. But my friends on the left promised me they were not until the left impinged on my freedom or the freedom of somebody I know. And they did this after promising more freedom. And now, obviously, I cannot identify with them. If they took my freedom or freedom of somebody I know, they aren't for freedom, clearly, right? And this is a bit like the Princess Bride. Clearly, I cannot choose the cup in front of me. And of course, the joke's on him. Both cups are poisoned. That, my friend, is the problem. And it's not, you're not immune to iocane powder, per the Princess Bride. If you haven't seen that movie, you got to watch that movie. It's too funny. But the left can't be for freedom if they took away anybody's freedom ever, really. And therefore, they don't represent me. Alienated, alone, hurt, betrayed. So I'll identify with freedom itself, as though that's a thing you can do. Little hint, that's not a thing you can do in the world at all. The idea of freedom alone by itself makes no sense. It cannot make any sense. The problem here is that it is impossible. Libertarianism is impossible. These questions have to be answered. Freedom from what? Freedom to do what? Are we free? What are we free from? Because it turns out that doing anything has consequences and risks, for sure. You could do it poorly. You could grab a knife and go to cut a carrot and cut your finger. Doing nothing also has consequences and risks. How do you understand freedom if what I just said is true? And it is true. Like, it's definitely true. Just think about this for a second. If doing anything or doing nothing has consequences and risks, clearly you are subject to both consequence and risk all the time, irrespective or independent of all other factors. And independent of your action or inaction. So the world's moving around you and entropy is real, buddy. Another way to think about this is to say that you were born into a world that is larger than you. That's how you were able to be born into it. It has to be bigger than you, or you couldn't be in it. It wouldn't contain you. And that you are connected to this world in some way, because you're here, and you cannot break free of it. And because it's a world, it has constraints. It has the constraints of whatever world it was you were born into. And it also has, we'll call them features for the moment, but they could also be thought of as constraints as well, because all features are constraints. Oops, that might be a problem. It has features like gravity, air, and the air changes with things like altitude due to gravity, oddly enough. It has wind, which is sometimes tornadoes or hurricanes, and sometimes almost absent, which can be most annoying and inconvenient. It has animals, some of which are great, like dogs, which are the best animals ever. Some of which are terrible. Right? There's some horrible animals. Locusts. Awful. Poisonous snakes and spiders. Not a fan. And nature. And nature in and of itself is deadly if not noticed properly and handled properly. Boy, that's a lot you got to do just to stay alive. And perhaps the most annoying of all, there's other people. Wow. Also, care, anger, hate, love, struggle, suffering, grace, repentance. All of these things are in the world that you were born into. You had no choice about this. I'm sure I've lost a few more viewers here. But wait, Mark. I thought this was about libertarianism. You know, the political position. Okay. Let me walk with you for a bit there, since I've just given you the key to why libertarian cannot make any sense. I'll play in your frame for a moment, just to exemplify the point. As a political movement, and politics is a bad binary frame, it makes no sense. If you need to know more about bad binary frames, please see this video. Where does libertarianism fit in this, quote, political spectrum? What positive statement can you make about libertarianism? Not a vague statement like, well, it's for freedom, the freedom to have property, all right? Because as we'll see in a moment, that doesn't work. Where does it stand on literally any issue? Because when I talk to libertarians, I can't find too many of them that agree on any issue. They just don't seem to have agreement on single issues at all. Big ones, small ones, it doesn't even matter. Okay, that silence in your head, that's my answer. It doesn't have a stance on anything at all. It's merely the statement that you don't like the two other available options. No, really, think about it longer. Even when libertarian leaders appear to take a stance, it's on a removal. It's on a rejection. Or it's on some ridiculous grounds like freedom, which freedom from what exactly? Or a statement of rejection. And it's not consistent, right? It doesn't last long because the next leader likely makes a different statement. Oops. And usually it's impossible to implement once you engage with the insane idea put forth. You probably haven't done that because you're hearing what you want to hear: more freedom, more liberty. Those are good things to be sure in a context, but I'm going to need your context first, sir. Now, let me be clear. What I'm saying is there's no possible political definition of libertarianism. You're not going to be able to nail down a set of political positions that defines libertarianism. It's just the people who hate the trade-offs of either party or all parties with clear political positions, hint, hint, in favor of an undefined middle ground, where you get what you want by virtue of no one taking it away. And that is what their statement of freedom is. I'm not impinged upon. And the problem is, libertarianism is a bastard child born out of certain Enlightenment statements by Enlightenment so-called philosophers some of whom were really not philosophers at all, if philosophers exist past Plato and Aristotle, and I have my doubts. A lot of them weren't making particularly political statements. They were making statements about how the world is, but almost all of them agreed with a larger framework in which there was a creator and a created world, and they were starting from there. Is that where you're starting from? So the problem is that in order for this freedom to happen, you'd have to have no rules at all, or ruler for that matter, no one enforcing the rules, and no rules. And of course, you cannot have a definition of individual freedom or a way to know that those definitions have been breached without rules. You have to define freedom. You have to define when that freedom is taken away and how you came to have it in the first place. The so-called Enlightenment philosophers didn't have to do that because they already did it, and they assumed Christendom, roughly speaking. The larger issue here, however, is what your brain is hiding from you. You don't know what you're up to quote Jordan Peterson. In using this freedom term unbounded, because that's what your brain is doing, right? It always seems to be an unbounded term lately, or at least very poorly defined, usually not defined at all, or defined in the negative, right? Defined by the absence of something. But what your brain is hiding from you is that you don't want responsibility because it impinges upon your freedom. Technically speaking, it does. Rules and responsibilities are bound up quite closely indeed. And unfortunately, that means that you cannot have one without the other. But rules are the way that we know that our freedom's been taken. Who's going to oversee or adjudicate the rules? Who's going to set it right when those rules are broken on purpose or by accident? Who's going to notify people of their rights, of their freedoms? Right. And that, my friend, is the problem. Do you want the rule that no one can take my property? That sounds like a good rule. A lot of Western societies seem to have that rule. First, you need a rule defining what your property is. Property rights require property rules, and that requires property responsibility. Oh, and what property ownership is and how that is determined. How do you go from no property to your property? Some societies have it inheritance only. That's it. The only way you can ever own property is inherit it. If you don't already have it, you can't ever get it. Those are property rights. They're sucky ones, but they're property rights, and they've been the norm for most of human history. Is that what you mean with your libertarianism? This requires rules, which means responsibility. And maybe it's not your personal responsibility, but like something has to oversee those rules and adjudicate those. There's got to be a court system somewhere. There has to be a justice system of some kind doing something. So you're not whining about having a justice system, you're whining about how it works. Someone has to interpret the rules. Somebody has to interpret intent. Did that person violate your rules by accident, your freedoms by accident, or on purpose? Because that should make a difference to their punishment and to the reparations. And it should constrain your anger, because you're going to have anger when people violate your freedom. That's what libertarianism is all about. I'm pissed off that I think people are or could violate my freedom. Who's going to constrain that so you don't go killing people? There's a responsibility there. And sure, a typical libertarian will conveniently rely on an existing system of justice to uphold those rules. Yet if you listen carefully, those are the systems impinging upon freedoms. Those are the systems they're complaining about. Oops. There's an inherent contradiction in libertarianism that they don't talk about conveniently. To be fair, I don't think they recognize it. I just don't think they're that bright. But no, I mean, seriously, listen closely. The court shouldn't be able to take property with eminent domain? Are you sure? So no one should ever take your property, no matter what, no matter how many people are harmed by your use or misuse of that property? What if a river runs on your property and you're poisoning it? Of course not. This is a silly idea. It's also an inane argument. When it comes down to brass tacks, no one wants that. And they show it every single time. They always want to redistribute property. Oh, that company polluted the property. I want their building. We should shut them down. What? They didn't even impinge on your freedom. Why do you want to shut down? Like, doesn't make any sense. Not to your political statement. And the thing is, anybody selling you that is lying to you. If they're selling you a system like that, where they're like, oh, we can just take away eminent domain, they're lying to you. You can't do that. Of course not. They also give you these simple examples that are easy for you to understand and say, see, this is easy. The government should get it right every time because it's easy. That's not true. Go to a court. Just walk in. Witness some of these cases. Be prepared to cry a lot because the level of stupidity and incompetence is amazing in the court system, at least in the US right now. But note that just by adding definitions of freedom and rules to help everybody, including yourself, to conform to freedom, like to have a freedom, for freedom to exist, you already have to have a government. If you bother to play it out in your head, and I have with others many times over the years, right? You will actually just reinvent government as such. Sure, you can argue that it would be a better government than what we have because it won't be, what it is now. It'll be something new. It'll be completely different. But all the problems with government now are not the type of government or the system of government. It's the people that run the damn government. They're the ones screwing it up. Are we following the Constitution in the US right now? I think not. Everybody's screaming that we're a democracy. We're not a democracy. We're a democratic republic. It's totally different. No overlap. Zero. Sorry. I want to tell you about that. Read the founding documents. They're available. Unless you can't read. Different problem. Don't be lazy. You have a responsibility to understand what you're talking about when you spew a nonsense word like libertarianism. Take that responsibility seriously. And look, this is why people think AI will save us. No, really. I mean, of course. AI, computers, mere rules cannot ever, and I assure you, this has been proven mathematically many times. I've read the papers. It's absolutely true. It's mathematically true. It will never work, really, because society is not just a set of rules. There are rules in society, but determining those rules and determining what to do when they're broken is not something that a computer can do, because the rules do not have a one-to-one correspondence. You broke this rule, therefore this happens every time. Maybe some rules have that property, but almost no rules have that property. Oops, there's an asymmetry there. Really. That's why we don't have computerized judging systems. That's why sci-fi dystopian novels have been written about that very thing over and over and over again. They've played it out in their head. It never seems to work out for them either. And it won't work out for you. And look, I get it. No one likes the idea of their freedom being taken or stolen or betrayed. Okay? I get it. Cry me a river. Okay? I've lost 2 houses, at least $1 million in cash, due to the lack of justice in the justice system. Flat out. I mean, you can go read this if you want. My cases are public. I've lost untold thousands of dollars to the incompetent IRS and the people that work there. Completely incompetent morons stealing my money and misappropriating it for wars overseas that I didn't agree to. Also, sending it to wars that I did agree to, because I'm not a no-war person, that's for sure. Look, I've been ripped off. I've been jailed over lies the government has sold to the cops, to the judges, to other people. You didn't pay that. I have a receipt. Hello? Oh, well, we're going to need to see that. You didn't need to see the you don't have a receipt. Don't know where that came from, bro. I've lost friends. I've seen people lose houses. I've gotten accused of so many things, all due to bad government. This happens to everybody. It happens because of poor politicians. I've written to politicians asking for help and gotten nothing. It happens due to corrupt bureaucrats. I've pointed out that there are problems. No one cares. No one's going to do anything about it. Get over it. That isn't going to change. People are not going to stop peopling anytime soon. And even when they do, it'll be a different world. And we'll have new rules. And things will be implemented differently. Until then, grow up. Get involved if you're really concerned. Fix the problem by taking responsibility for a small part of it. At least. And get over your paranoia. You have not had as much stuff taken from you as I have. Stop whining. All of this is making you a worse person. I assure you. Libertarianism is an identification against. It's not an identification for. You're not bound by a common set of values and virtues. You're just crying undefined freedom, which has an infinite number of definitions, technically speaking. Actually, mathematically provable, infinite number of definitions. They go on forever. Well, what are you fighting for? What are you uniting about? Why are you identifying or trying to identify this way? Why don't you put your time, energy, and attention to doing some good in the world? Or at least making yourself better. Because you're spending a lot of time on a political thing that can't make you better. It's outside of you. But you have the most control over yourself. Why don't you take some responsibility for you and make yourself better?